It was a sunny afternoon, and 17-year-old Jamal had just finished his schoolwork for the day. He loved the freedom his bike offered him, a moment to escape, to ride through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. As the cool wind rushed past him, he felt a sense of calm, a brief respite from the usual stress of school and life. His sneakers hit the pedals rhythmically as he zipped down the sidewalk, his bike tires humming against the pavement. Jamal had grown up in this neighborhood, and though he loved it, he was no stranger to the occasional glance, sometimes friendly, sometimes not so much. He didn't think much of it, choosing instead to focus on the rhythm of his ride. But today, as he rounded the corner near the local park, his peaceful afternoon ride was interrupted by the sudden flash of police sirens. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just enjoying a quiet afternoon on his bike. But the cop car quickly pulled up beside him, blocking his path. Two officers got out of the car, both white men in their mid-30s. One of them, Officer Matthews, stood with his hands on his hips, his eyes scanning Jamal from head to toe. "Hey, kid," Officer Matthews said, his tone more commanding than friendly. "Where are you headed?" Jamal slowed his bike, uncertain of what was happening. "Just riding home," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity around here," Officer Matthews said, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you might be involved in something. Step off the bike." Jamal's grip tightened around the handlebars. He had been stopped before, often by officers who didn't seem to think a black teenager on a bike was ever just a teenager on a bike. But still he complied, stepping off the bike and standing on the sidewalk. "What's this all about, officer?" Jamal asked, trying to remain polite, though his anxiety was building. "Don't get smart with me, kid," Officer Matthews snapped. "You've been riding around here too long. I'm just asking questions. We need to make sure you're not up to something." Jamal felt the heat rise in his chest, a familiar knot of frustration tightening. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a suspect. As Officer Matthews moved closer, Jamal instinctively took a step back, his nerves getting the best of him. "What's the problem here, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice wavering slightly. But before Officer Matthews could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Matthews, Walker." The voice was stern but filled with authority. The two officers turned in unison, both startled by the commanding presence behind them. Sergeant Johnson, the precinct commander, stood with his arms crossed, his uniform sharp and impeccable. He was a tall, muscular black man, and his eyes were fixed on his officers with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "What the hell is going on here?" Sergeant Johnson asked, his gaze moving between Jamal and the two officers. "Sir," Officer Matthews stammered, clearly caught off guard. "We were just—" "I can see what you were doing, Matthews." Sergeant Johnson cut him off, his voice ice cold. "You were harassing this young man for no reason." Jamal stood frozen, his heart racing. He recognized Sergeant Johnson, but he couldn't place where he had seen him before. He had certainly never expected the commanding officer of the precinct to be involved in this situation. The officers glanced at each other, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. Sergeant Johnson's gaze never wavered from his subordinates. "Do you two have any idea who this is?" Sergeant Johnson asked, his voice dripping with authority. The officers looked at Jamal, confused, and then shook their heads. "No, sir," Officer Walker said hesitantly. Sergeant Johnson sighed, his shoulders sagging in disappointment. He then turned to Jamal, his stern expression softening. "Jamal, you okay?" he asked gently. Jamal blinked, not sure what was going on. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied cautiously, still processing the situation. "This," Sergeant Johnson said, looking at the officers with disdain, "is my son." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The officers froze, their faces a mixture of shock and embarrassment. The moment the truth hit them, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The officers' faces turned a shade of red that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. They stood there, not knowing how to react. Sergeant Johnson stepped closer to Jamal, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can go now, son," Sergeant Johnson said softly, nodding toward the bike. "I'll handle this." Jamal hesitated for a moment, still processing everything. He turned to look at the officers, both of whom were now fidgeting nervously, avoiding his gaze. The weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air. "Thank you," Jamal muttered quietly, before getting back on his bike. As he rode off, he could feel the eyes of the officers burning into his back. He didn't need to look back to know that they were likely regretting their actions. Sergeant Johnson didn't waste any time. After watching Jamal ride off, he turned to face the two officers, his jaw clenched with anger. You two have a lot of explaining to do, Sergeant Johnson said, his voice low but filled with authority. What the hell were you thinking? Officer Matthews, clearly shaken, stammered. Sir, we thought— I don't give a damn what you thought, Sergeant Johnson interrupted. This young man did nothing wrong and you treated him like a criminal. You will be held accountable for this. Officer Walker shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't like that, sir. We were just doing our job. Your job, Sergeant Johnson spat, is to protect and serve, not to harass people based on their race or appearance. You should both be ashamed of yourselves. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. I'm going to file a formal complaint against both of you, Sergeant Johnson continued. And you'll be reporting to Internal Affairs. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior in my precinct. The officers remained silent, unable to offer any defense. The tension between them and their commander was palpable. As Sergeant Johnson walked away, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Jamal, he said when his son picked up, I want you to know I'm handling this. You did nothing wrong, and I'll make sure they understand that. Jamal's voice was quiet, but filled with gratitude. Thanks, Dad. I knew something was off about the way they were acting. Sergeant Johnson smiled to himself, even though his heart was heavy with the knowledge that his own officers had failed in their duties. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride that his son had handled the situation with grace. Go home, son. I'll be there later, Sergeant Johnson said. We'll talk more then. As he hung up, Sergeant Johnson knew this was a moment of reckoning, not just for the officers, but for the system that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. The day ended with a quiet dinner at the Johnson household. Jamal and his father sat together, eating and talking about life. It was a conversation that was long overdue, one about the world and the challenges that Jamal would continue to face as a young black man. You did the right thing today, Jamal, Sergeant Johnson said, looking at his son with a proud yet concerned gaze. And I'll always have your back. Jamal nodded, knowing that his father would do everything in his power to protect him. But deep down he knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about changing the way people saw each other and demanding respect, no matter who you were. Thanks, Dad, Jamal replied. I know you're always there. As the evening wore on, both father and son knew that the world wasn't perfect, but they also knew that change was possible. And with every small step, they would continue to fight for justice, respect, and equality.